Welcome, good afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. Dear colleagues and partners, for another session of the Erasmus Go Digital webinar series. This session is directed for users of an in-house system or with a third-party software. And this morning we already had a session for dashboard users. So if you want to catch that one, the recordings will be made available via the European Student Card Initiative YouTube channel. First, maybe some explanation about the chat and the Q&A function for this webinar. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. And if you see a question that you find interesting or similar to the one that you want to ask, just please vote for the question, because the questions with the most votes will be on top. And then we will see if we will answer the question live, or if some of my colleagues will answer the questions via the chat function. We have a full agenda, but I would like to say some words about the agenda for today, as I think there are two main themes that we will want to address during the session. First of all, I think we would like to highlight all the work being done by partners on a day-to-day basis and the continuous work that goes on behind the scenes. But on the other hand, we are aware of the things that are not going as well or as planned. And we noticed during the previous that there was a lot of grievances about some of the things that were happening, and that there was a need to be able to communicate about certain issues or to connect to each other about certain issues. So we will also present some additional actions and a way forward to address those things. We have different speakers, but I would like to introduce the first speaker today, who will welcome you all, and that is Alexandra Licht. She is a policy officer at the European Commission for DG Education and Culture, and she will provide some update on the state of play of the European Student Card Initiative. Hello, Alexandra, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone.
I can hear you perfectly and I can see you.
Excellent. Great. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. That will be a rather short update from my side. So first of all, it's excellent to see so many people here and all the part of the consortium as well. What is the idea of this webinar? We wanted to, first of all, provide some update on the ongoing activities within EWP. So as you know, the help desk has been operating since a while, and this is a very big change, and we hope that you feel the difference, that there are people that do a lot of work in order to answer to all your questions. In addition, we would like to update that we've been putting in place a governance structure that will assure that the voices of all institutions are heard, and also all the stakeholders, and will be more information presented on this today. And of course, another very important thing is what came up from the last webinars is that there is a need for more interoperability in order to be able to digitalize IAAs and LAs by the end of the year, which, as you know, and I assume there will be further questions on that in the chat. The expectation is, as you know, this academic year is a transitional year. And a transitional year, we understand that there is a lot of effort put from your place in order to digitalize. You're all doing excellent work, and you're all doing your best in order to be ready. But we know that this is a long process. This is why this transitional year was extended to the end of this calendar year. What does it mean? That the transitional year, instead of ending in September, it will end in the 31st of December 2022, which means that from now until December, institutions are expected to do whatever they can in order to be ready to digitalize IAAs and learning agreements sooner than later. And from 2023, the digitalization readiness will be point in the actual monitoring, of course, under the condition that the systems are fit for purpose. And the monitoring will be monitoring the efforts that institutions are putting in place in order to digitalize. So what does it mean in practice? That in order to assure that you're all up to speed. Together with the consortium, we have been preparing an action plan that will be presented also later in order to tackle interoperability, because we know that it's a complex system and there is a need to connect between various players. So to be ready digitally doesn't mean that only you need to be ready, but also your partners. And this is why exactly a lot of effort and funding will be put in order to ensure that you will receive all the necessary support, that your providers will receive the necessary support, that there will be the most relevant guiding materials, that there will be all the necessary tools for you in order to be ready by the end of this current year. So I hope you will enjoy the presentations, which are very informative, and I would like to pass the floor to my colleagues, and I hope that it will be fruitful. I'm sure it will be, and I would like to already congratulate and reinforce all of you for all the hard work you've been putting in this endeavor of digitalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And before we move on to the main agenda points, I would first like to introduce my colleague Paul, who is the task lead for communication outreach working at the Ghent University. As some of you might be aware, we had a survey recently, and some of you might even have responded and filled it in. So thank you for that, with questions for everything ABP Plus related. And Paul will present today some of the earlier findings regarding that survey, and because those were also used to inform us with everything that will come. So good morning, good afternoon, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, David. And I will indeed talk a little bit about this survey that we did and that many of the colleagues probably responded to. And it's an opportunity to zoom out a little bit from the, and can you see the screen, David? Do you see
I can see your other screen. I see a web browser now.
Yeah, that's not the correct one. So let me try to share the right one. After all those Zoom sessions, still struggling. This is any better?
Yes, this is the right one. Thank you, Paul.
So what I was trying to say is that I kind of want to take up the thread where we left it at the previous webinar, where we also already shared some preliminary results from the survey. Those who did not attend the previous webinar, the recordings are available on the official ESCI YouTube channel, and this webinar will be also posted there, and also presentations will become available after the session. Now, what we tried to do with this survey was to get some information from the wide higher education community about the state of play of Erasmus without paper on the first hand, but also have a little bit more forward-looking and get some insight on the current processes that higher education institutions have available in their institution, the current systems they use, in order to future-oriented also look into how we should further proceed with digitizing this whole Erasmus administration efforts, because, as you know, it's a cornerstone of the new Erasmus program. And like I said, I want to zoom out a little bit before we go back to the reality, and the next presentation will more focus on the current issues and answers that we try to have on the questions that are out there. A little bit of context. So we collected feedback from colleagues mostly working at the IRO about 1 month between March and April, which is also means that some of the findings might need to be updated by now because we're 2 months later. We had about 700 respondents from about 560 higher education institutions, and 419 of them completed the survey. It seems from the findings, if you compare it to the data that we also have available about connections in Erasmus without paper network, that Erasmus dashboard users are somewhat underrepresented. And of course, it's a rather small percentage of ESCI holders that completed the survey. But from the other hand, it's also very informative for us to look to get insight from more than 700 colleagues on the current situation and the future outlook. I will first focus a little bit on the current state of affairs about EWP implementation, and to give you a little bit of an idea about the profile of participants. You can see here the range of outgoing mobilities prior to COVID. So I think it's a nice division between some smaller institutions, but also some very big one, like 500 and more outgoing Erasmus students in a given academic year. It probably doesn't come as a surprise that the large majority of the respondents worked at the central level, so at the central university level. There are also a few or 1/4 of the answers came from faculty department to school level. It's probably also aligned with who is responsible at the higher education institutions for the overall coordination of the Erasmus program, as well as the Erasmus white paper and digitization agenda. If we then zoom in a little bit on the tools used for the different processes related to mobility, we can see that the majority uses the Erasmus dashboard, but also the current colleagues currently in this webinar who are representing institutions using an in-house system or a third-party system were represented to quite a high extent. So about a little bit more than 30% came from this third-party providers. For interinstitutional agreements, about the same for learning agreements, and then also outgoing mobilities, incoming mobilities, there the percentages are even higher of the third party and also in-house systems. It's also interesting to see that there's still colleagues working with spreadsheets to manage mobilities, and we hope that the Erasmus dashboard is an answer to their needs in order to also join the digitization agenda. The slide before somewhat contrasts with what we see in terms of EWP connections today. So there's 2,454 higher educations connected for interinstitutional agreements, and about 77% of them use the dashboard. It's, of course, dashboard is mostly targeted towards small institutions, so it could be the case that the bigger universities using third-party systems are more exchanging with other big universities, less with dashboard, but at least this is a little bit of an insight on how in the current registry the participation is present. Also for learning agreements, there we have about more than 2,000 universities connected, or higher education institutions, and the percentage for dashboard users is 82% there. If we look at the next analysis or the next question, that is about which tools that higher education institutions use in order to be able to participate, and whether they had to switch tools. And there we see that quite a large percentage had to switch to the Erasmus dashboard, either using in-house or that didn't have a tool at this time. But also about 40% is still using the same tool, and I guess that most of the colleagues using third-party software are in this situation. If we then look into the figures of the current status of interinstitutional agreements and EWP at the institution, we see that many respondents indicated that they are negotiating content of agreements with partners not using EWP. I think this doesn't come as a surprise, because before we start exchanging the data, I think we need to have some kind of conversation on, okay, do we want to continue the cooperation? What are the cooperation conditions we would like to have? Do we keep the same number of students and all of that? So it's more effective to have such conversation outside the scope of EWP, and then once you have an agreement on this basic layer, I would say, it's good to confirm data points via EWP, and that's what about 41% of the colleagues responding are doing. And there, I think it's very interesting to see that oftentimes, even if you have a common agreement via email, once you share the data, that it might look somewhat different, or the interpretation looks different once we have a more standardized way of sharing data, especially when you say we want to renew the existing agreement from the previous program. I often had cases that once we shared then the agreement via EWP, that we interpreted or that we translated the PDF version of the agreement in a different manner into our system, and that there we still need to kind of negotiate and further align the content of the agreement. And then there's also more than 1/4 of the colleagues, 26% that exchange successfully at least one interinstitutional agreement via EWP, and that's the start, of course. And then about 30% exchanged several interinstitutional agreements, which is of course important, and everything has to do with exchange. And interoperability will also be addressed in the next presentation, because we know that you have a lot of questions regarding this topic. The status of learning agreements, here we also see that many colleagues still use PDF. Of course, those that are ready to go digital are also depending, and that also counts for interinstitutional agreements. Of course, you're also depending on your partners. If your partner is not ready, you need to find other ways. And there we are kind of forced to use PDF in order to make sure that we comply to the rules of the program and to have an agreement signed before the mobility takes place. But there again, also about 30% of the colleagues answered that they exchanged successfully several learning agreements via EWP, and I'm sure that those numbers are still augmenting rapidly during this period of time. I think there was a huge peak also in usage of the OLA tool and dashboard we saw in the course of May. So more and more students are preparing their learning agreement for mobilities for the next term. So it will also be reflected in these numbers. Then we have the European Student Identifier, and if you were present at the previous webinar, there was a presentation about what exactly is the European Student Identifier. I don't think it's very relevant for the IRO to know all the details, but it's very important to understand that the ESI is a very important technical attribute that needs to be exchanged in order to make systems being able to identify students uniquely, especially if you combine different steps of the mobility process. It's important to understand, okay, this is about exactly this particular student. And if we look into the numbers there, we see that a big majority of the colleagues either implemented ESI or implementation is ongoing, or that the colleagues were in contact with ESI. With the IT about ESI, because it's at first it's the IT department that needs to deploy such functionality. And I also am aware that many of the colleagues using third-party software are also trying to connect their system or their login mechanism to the mobility provider in order to have the ESI at once generated by the university also in this system. And I think many or all the systems offer such federated identity or single sign-on solution where students can log into the system via the local account. And then this ESI should also travel with the data that is shared there. If we look at it from the My Academic ID perspective, there we have about 3,430 higher education institutions that are present in My Academic ID, and more than 2,000 already release ESI. So I think for many of the colleagues also present probably in this presentation, This is a bit of a hidden milestone where our IT team is working on it, but that IROs might not be aware that this is happening behind the scenes. And of course, like I said before, that's the ideal case scenario, because it's something that we as an IRO shouldn't care about. It's something very technical. We just need to make sure that it is there and that our system can use the benefits that this functionality brings. If we then look into the biggest obstacles to implement EWP, the majority of the colleagues indicated a lack of support from EWP. I hope that with the ESCI information service desk, that this number is now getting less. Of course, as I said before, the survey the responses were gathered in a period that the official ESCI service desk was not yet launched, or only towards the end of the period that the survey was open. So I hope that at least in that regard, we've made some progress. And then, of course, it's also important to see that other partners might not be ready to exchange data via EWP, and this, of course, compromises the possibility to exchange. And there's also some delays in delivery of functionalities, both in-house and third-party solutions. Looking at the free comments, and it's interesting to see that large groups of colleagues indicated the same issues on functionalities, probably also interoperability issues, technical issues. And I think when Alex referred in her introduction that we are working very hard to address such issues. And I'm also happy that Joao will be able to announce some of the answers that we try to formulate on such issues. Let's now forget a little bit about what's currently in terms of processes that we need to support in a digital manner. What's currently on the table, like learning agreements and interinstitutional agreements. I think all participants are very much aware about the deadlines and the roadmap. Also, when it comes to transcript of records and nominations, that per part of the ESCI roadmap. And let's now zoom in a little bit to other processes apart from this IIA and learning agreements. Because it's very interesting to see that, for example, when it comes to traineeships, that the challenge there will be completely different than for student mobilities, where we have communication between higher education institutions holding an ESCI charter that have some obligation to be able to exchange, for example, learning agreements or interinstitutional agreements or transit of records. This is not true for the majority of mobilities taking place in the traineeship, because about 70% of them concern mobility with non-ESCI holders, and there are other solutions. When this kind of process need to be digitized, other solutions will need to come up with. But before discussing such issues, it's of course important to know that the majority concern non-ESCI holders, and as well that also majority of respondents do not have a tool at all to manage processes related to Erasmus Plus traineeships. We also have the international mobility, both on the key action 171, but also under the 131 key action. And there we asked the colleagues how they currently manage interinstitutional agreements with partners that are not part of the Erasmus program countries, the so-called international mobility. And there about 30% said they use the same tool as for interinstitutional agreements, and probably many of the colleagues using third-party software also use the same tool for their mobility outside and inside Erasmus, but also quite the 35–36% said they do not have a tool to manage such agreements. Same figures for learning agreements, no tool at all, scores even higher. and then about 26% said they use the same tool. Staff mobility agreements, so far we mostly discuss student mobility, of course, but when we look at it as a whole, and if we want to achieve the ambition to have the whole processes digitized, we also should look into staff mobility agreements, and there it's very interesting to see that about 54% has no tool at all at the moment. Some of them are planning to implement one. And then some colleagues indicate about 30% that they do have a tool and that they use the same tool as for learning agreements. Now let's also look into, if we now discuss those mobility processes, and it's more informative, it's in order to inform the next steps that of course should be taken by the European Commission, taking into account the feedback from stakeholders like digital offices, higher education institutions. But let's also look into what the higher education institutions, at least those that completed the survey, see as important processes to be digitized further. And for this first table, you can see the answers on the question on how useful the respondents find to digitize the mobility processes indicated in the table, and they could give it a score from 1 to 10, and then we see that the highest average score is for automatic processes related to OLS. Certificates of arrival departure, I think this will also be a hidden milestone once the mobility APIs for incoming and outgoing students are implemented. Also learning agreements, interinstitutional agreements for international student mobility, so outside the scope of the Erasmus program countries, gets a rather high score, and you can see the other averages, and the slides will be made available afterwards. What we also asked the colleagues was to give their order of the processes to digitize next. So they had the opportunity to rank the processes, and in the table you see up till rank 5 the percentages, and if you take those percentages together, and this also is related to the previous slide, then nominations seem to be quite important for higher education institutions, and indeed that's one of the next steps to be taken, already kind of officially announced as well. Automatic reporting to beneficiary module, it's definitely on the radar, and we hope indeed to make progress there, because I think all higher education institutions need to do a lot of reporting. Currently it's done on a manual basis. The whole EWP ID is 100% applicable on this kind of reporting, so it's also something to further work on and try to achieve in the future. And then you can see the other priorities on how the colleagues ranked how the digitization roadmap could look like. Once again, I would like to stress this is very informative. This will, of course, be shared with the colleagues from the Commission. They are present today in the presentation, so they already see it. But the whole report will be made available to the national agencies, to the digital officers, to the European Commission, and of course to the higher education community. I would also like to highlight some of the comments about the digitization priorities. One is the Erasmus Plus grant agreements and the grant payment. This is, of course, something that can be dealt with within your system without depending on your partner university, because the grant agreement, that's between the student and the sending higher education institution. So this is definitely not something Erasmus without paper could cater for, although I do reckon it's very important that such processes get digitized. And in our case, in Ghent University, where we use an in-house system, this is already the case, and I can testify that the amount of paperwork diminished massively, and that the colleagues are very happy to have a more digital flow for such process. But then also very important remark, okay, we can look into the future, but let's first focus on what we need to do today, interinstitutional agreements and learning agreements, before we move ahead with other processes. And that's exactly what we also want to stress and do today during the next presentation, where we will also address the interoperability reinforcement action plan. If we then zoom in a little bit on the sources that you use to find information about EWP, it's very interesting to see that the national agency plays a vital role here. Within the governance structure of the Erasmus Without Paper Plus and the ESCI, the European Student Card Initiative governance structures, there is a monthly meeting with the digital offices, where together with the European Commission and the consortium, they discuss issues, a wide number of issues, I would say, and of course they remain a very important actor in this whole process, also to inform the higher education institutions about Erasmus Without Paper and the digitization aspects under the European Student Card Initiative. A bit of the same finding when it comes to the most useful format, and that's the training and webinar organized by the national agencies. Also the Erasmus Goes Digital webinars feature for 40% of the colleagues, about 40%, as an useful format to find information about EWP and to learn about the novelties and how to make progress in terms of implementation. It is also a large percentage of colleagues who indicate that a group of colleagues using the same tool would be very useful. And that is also one of the findings during the previous webinar that I already mentioned. There were many colleagues who tried to join forces and form user groups with colleagues using the same tool, where they can discuss or when they can ask questions on how other colleagues are dealing with certain issues, about implementation issues. So this was one of the important feedback points, both from the webinar and from the survey, and I'm happy that we will get back to that a little bit later today. Because also interoperability featured high in your feedback and questions during the previous webinar, and that's why I will now finish my presentation, and David will hand over to the colleagues from the European University Foundation, who will address the action plan that we put together in terms of in order to try to tackle interoperability issues.
Yes, that's correct, Paul. Thank you for your presentation. And I think the survey shows that it is something that getting feedback from the community is something, and the user is something very important to us. And it's something that we try to do often. And as you can see, we take those results very seriously, and we also use it to reinforce our other actions and work. As Paul mentioned, now for the main segment of today's webinar, I would like to give the floor to Joao, who is Executive Manager of the European Education Foundation, and Valère, who is the EWP Plus Manager at EUF, and they will introduce the action plan, which was elaborated at the request of the European Commission, to set out to fully make the IAs and LAs interoperable and set it out as a priority, and to respond to many of the aspects and the grievances that you mentioned during the previous webinar. So Joao and Valère, welcome.
Thank you. I suppose I will start with a short introduction, and then Joao can all tackle with all the difficult questions. We have a very good division of labor. First of all, I think it's important to reiterate the fact that our teams, the various EWP Plus teams, have only been in operation since the 1st of January. And I think we are really making progress now. We're talking about communication, the network itself, the dashboard, the service desk, all of these things are now really getting into place, and that's important. Even so, we were very, we were struck by the fact that many people during the last webinar said that they were not feeling enough support, and in consultation with or even at the request of the DG Eeckhout, we set up a new action plan for 6 months, which on top of all the things that have already been agreed and that will be taking place for the rest of 2022 and 2023, we would like to have a real action plan that will take care of some of these issues that also Paul has mentioned just a few seconds ago. The action plan is officially called the Interoperability Reinforcement Plan. And we are in the final stages of approving it, so that we hope we can start with everything by the 1st of July. As I said, this will be immediate action. It will also be holistic in approach, in the sense that it will try and deal with things that are very interconnected. We have tried to divide it into various subsections. Joao will tell you all about it. But some of the main points is that we want to strengthen the overall network of users by providing better guidelines, taking care of errors, and finding solutions to problems that already exist at this moment. For that, we will initiate beta testing. We will work on statistics. We will have an assessment procedure, but okay, Joao will tell you about that. And we will also have better information in terms of communication and training. One of the major things will also be user groups. And of course, this is also linked to what we call the governance of the EWP, which is the various bodies that will come into existence to deal with everything that is going on, and that will be consultative, and that will also inform both the EWP Plus teams and DG Eeckhout about what is going on and what should be going on. Not to forget is also the service desk. We have already increased its range a lot, but we will go even further. And this is also part of the new action plan. And what is even more important for many of you is that we will have more cooperation between third-party providers and in-house developers and ourselves. And for that, we will take also some specific actions. But Joao, I think you can take over here and go into more detail, and then if necessary, we can all have questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valère, and good afternoon to all the colleagues that have joined us. Give me just a second to share my screen with you to then go over the key elements of the action plan that we would like to share with you today. As my colleagues have pointed out, and I hope that you can see it in full screen now, a lot of this is reflecting concerns that I've been picked up through the surveys, through the previous webinar, where the feedback was really very clear, really very, a call for action, if you will. And so further to the introduction that Valère kindly shared, let me try to, even if it is an holistic plan, to break this into three vectors, three areas of work. The first of which is about transitioning EWP from a trust-based network into a rule-based network. Clearly, we need better regulation to make sure that data exchange and interoperability work well. So let me tell you how we plan to go about it. The problem statement, I think, is already quite clear. I think it warrants being said that in the course of the work of the colleagues of the service desk, some of the meetings and other messages that we received, we found a disquieting pattern. And I noticed a colleague remarking about the fact that EWP might not be able to handle several providers. There are several providers, in fact, that exchange data rather well. But we've also found several examples of providers that would inform us or their clients that a given API had been implemented and completed, but upon closer inspection, what sometimes turns out to happen is that it's not a complete, comprehensive implementation. I put an example on screen, which is well known to many of us. There are others that are more complicated. And so this are the kind of things that are behind the hood that then impact the user experience. Now, the first step to try to address this will be the definition of mandatory business requirements. These, in essence, complement the templates that we all know and love that have been published for many months now, that have informed the data models of the specifications. Because this is a way to provide greater clarity on what is not optional, coming back to the remark from just a little bit ago. These are documents that need to reflect the needs and the perspectives of the end users. And they will play into several of the subsequent actions, which is why we are very keen to start working on them at once. I would like to apologize to the colleagues that are joining us online, because when I write start M1 and end M2, this is not the most intelligible possible. M1 stands, as you might suspect, for month 1, month 2, etc., etc. This is because we are working towards getting everything ready to actually officially start working on the action plan. And the expectation, as it was already mentioned, is that month 1 will be already 2 weeks from now, starting in July. Until then, this taxonomy that most of you, I think, are familiar with is used for this reason. Now, with the mandatory business requirements moving, there is an important step, which, if I'm very honest with you, is all about quick wins. It's all about being able to not wait longer than strictly necessary. And what we will set out to do is to use the fact that we run the biggest node in EWP, which connects and talks to many other nodes, to try to assess what kind of errors, technical errors, are happening across the network. With that knowledge, we can take the initiative of investigating what the cause is, trying to identify solutions, and working with the colleagues that need to be involved to accelerate their resolution. This kind of cooperation exists more or less innately among technical colleagues, but it's not formalized. There is no mandate. There is no clear role and responsibility, which is something that we can change in this manner. So we have to start taking, of course, that this can and will be informed as well by what we see on the service desk. I think there is also a question in the Q&A about, under which conditions does one party reach out to another? So let's make this the default so that we can make as quick progress as possible. This is something that will keep us busy throughout the length of the action plan. I forgot to mention that the action plan is scoped to the second half of this year, if the current timeline holds. That's why you're going to see many actions starting in month 1, ending in month 6. There will be a few exceptions that I will try to explain and make sense of together with you. I said in the beginning that action 2 is about quick wins, but there are some more deeper structural changes that are also necessary, which brings me to action 3. Many of you know, I think most of you will know, that last year we started the technical testing process, which has been completed with a significant number of providers. But the significance of the results of that testing has made it clear that not all of the testing results indeed applied to what is called a production environment. Environment, and I'm sorry for the technical jargon, is basically where end users are and the version of the software that they use. This is unfortunate. It, in fact, constitutes a breach of the testing protocol. It speaks to what I mentioned in the beginning, which is trust and goodwill apparently only get us so far. And there are solutions for this. There's a whole industry standard approach to what is called conformance testing. And so we're going to bring some heavier artillery to the EWP environment with the aim, with the goal of making sure that once a testing result is published following more stringent protocols, that the margin of error vis-a-vis the reality witnessed by the end users is either very, very small or ideally non-existent. This is really a change of paradigm. There were benefits, to be very clear, about keeping a more light touch approach. Should it have worked? And they have to do with cost, with complexity, with speed, but results being what they are, of course, we need to step up. And I'm very happy to let you know that for this task, the lead will be taken by our colleagues from IBM, which obviously have many years of experience with this kind of industry standards and compliance. I think it's also the benefit that it provides an impartial standpoint for the design of this process, make sure they're of the highest quality possible. Here, what we have is a process that is bound to take more than 6 months. The design, the implementation of all of this will undoubtedly spill over beyond the original scope of the current action plan. But I think we will already have important results to show from here until the end of the year. There is a fourth action that still pertains to this rather more technical architectural elements. And that is that there is work underway already to essentially afford us a very important and a very useful superpower. Because currently we do not see errors because, and I mean technical errors, because EWP is, as many of you will know, a point-to-point network. Data packages go from one node to the other. But there are tools and techniques that would allow for all such technical errors to be logged, which you can imagine would be incredibly important for analysis, for us to be able to monitor whether all of a sudden there's a peak of errors in a given node, and then we can direct our attention, the technical team's attention, and take much quicker action. Usually nowadays, we will find this maybe through a ticket, oftentimes not necessarily so, even for network users that will open tickets next to their providers. So the work on setting up this infrastructure is already well underway. It has in fact started before the action plan, because of course the action plan also has synergies with the work plan that is already in place. So the start in M1 is technically not accurate, but the really important point is that we expect that by month 2, this framework will already be in place, at least to a very large extent, because the next step will take a little bit longer, which is we need all of the nodes to implement this capability so that we can receive the errors from them. We're still not going to invade someone's installation and force changes. So this can become an incredibly powerful tool, because the kind of monitoring that you can do in a local system becomes somewhat more challenging at a network level. We will try to take that step. And with this, I change gears a little bit. So far I've been talking about the regulation of the network, but I think it's important to not forget about the users of the network. And my colleagues have already mentioned, I think particularly the webinars in April were quite striking. I think we all remember very well, many of you starting to share contacts, ask each other questions, are you using this, are you using that? And that's an important conversation. It's a conversation that ideally wouldn't be necessary, but as long as it is, I think we have an obligation, whether moral or otherwise, to try to support it and to also try to improve the support that we can provide. So to try to make progress on this front, and these are the actions that are foreseen. And the first one is actually very ambitious. Again, today in the chat, I believe, or in the Q&A, an example of maybe the same example I already mentioned, a colleague mentioning, I have an issue, I ask for testing to be carried out. As I mentioned in the previous point of the logs of technical errors, we don't see everything that, we don't know the full extent of the interoperability issues. So this action point is about rendering them transparent. It's important to make a distinction that seeing does not mean that we can fix them. That would be ideal, but I think by now the logic is familiar to most of you. Whoever runs a certain service or installation is typically the party that will be involved in the fixing. But seeing it, making it explicit, tracking them, we hope that it can help to make sure that tickets are acted upon, are followed. We can look to generate statistics with the issues that are popping up. We can again look into trends. Think of it as the other hemisphere of the error technical logging. So the idea is that the already existing ESCI service desk will be given this responsibility. We need to work out some practicalities with the providers, because obviously the best case scenario is that you do not have to open 2 tickets. That will require a little bit of integration, a little bit of refactoring, as I mentioned in the slide, and it requires both parties to agree on certain basic elements. There are fallback plans in places, and this is something that we want to start working also at once. Now we come to something that both Alexandra and Valère, and I think Paul have touched upon in different ways, which is, I also touched upon, and I mentioned the example of the last round of webinars, colleagues exchanging, trying to organize themselves. And so the notion of establishing user groups seems to be a very obvious and a very important one. And there's someone that already took the stage today that has been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to accelerate this. So if Paul would agree, I would be perhaps very tempted to give him the floor for him to introduce this, this point.
Yes, thank you, Joao. And indeed, the feedback from the colleagues, both at the webinar and the last webinar, and as well in the survey, indicated that there's a clear need, or that the community would like to be able to exchange ideas and implementation issues with colleagues using the same system. And therefore, we indeed are working, or we are almost done with it, to establish such system-specific user groups. And hopefully many of the colleagues will find an answer there on how they can interact with other colleagues using the same provider, the same tool. And it's my pleasure to also announce that you can already join the user groups via a digital Slack space, and you have the link there. We can also post it in the chat as if possible, and there you can already go to this space. It's an existing Slack channel, but it has a huge user base already of 740 colleagues. So that's the advantage of being able to recycle some of the work that's been out there and that we were engaged in from the very start, because this grew as a bottom-up initiative where colleagues try to connect and to interact with each other. So now we will kind of more officially start promoting this Slack space. There's still a little bit of work ahead of us, also in order to provide some guidelines on the usage and all of that. But I think it's an important first step that everybody interested in joining such user group, and it might be interesting that the colleagues launch a poll whether or not you think this is a useful initiative. And I would also like to highlight that the user groups, it will not only be a digital workspace where you can interact with each other, but that we will also provide the possibility to have 2 yearly meetings where we will collect feedback on the needs, the state of play. We will take into consideration the ESCI implementation, how it impacts ongoing operations and existing processes. So this will be a very open space where also colleagues will be able to contribute to the more governance aspects of the whole EWP+, because the user groups will be part of what we refer to as business process owners, which will become an important layer within the overall governance of the European Student Card Initiative. And there will be an interplay between this open user groups together with a standing group of experts, which will be a much more concise group of people who will discuss as well the feedback received in the user group. So this will really reinforce each other, and it will be a two-way communication from the user groups towards those expert groups and the other way around. So we really hope that with setting up such structure that many of the needs and the colleagues wanting to express issues, wanting to express ideas on how to tackle them, on how to move forward, will be catering to your needs. And as I said, it's the first step. We will continue the work, and we will also, of course, at the most possible extent, try to incorporate your feedback and everything we do, both in terms of finding solutions, but as well as finding getting a glimpse of what's going on at the level of the higher education institutions. And therefore, we hope that many of the colleagues will join the user groups. And please feel free to already subscribe to the Slack channel and find your way around and get in touch with colleagues using the same system.
I have one remark, Paul. When you said you mean twice a year, not every 2 years, correct?
I mean twice a year indeed, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, David, for being alert.
And I see that we have the poll running. I don't know if everyone can see that, but I can see that I think around 60% of people have voted at the moment. We will keep it open a little longer, but I see people are still coming in. But I see that like at the moment we have around 52% of people saying that they are interested in joining the user groups, and around 40% saying maybe so under if they have more ideas about the specific use of the user groups and how everything will look. But like as I said, I think this format and the setup is really specifically to tailor towards the needs of the people who are willing and want to be able to connect with each other. So for those people, this should be a medium that responds directly to that sense of urgency and that necessity. I think I will close the poll and then give the floor back to you, Joao.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much to Paul for chiming in on this topic. My computer is already racing ahead. You can sense the enthusiasm, but before I move to the next slide, maybe just a small point that might be worth expanding on, because it was mentioned that the user groups will become part of the EWP governance structure, and maybe that's something that we can elaborate, because I know there's a lot of interest in this topic as well. So with regards to the governance, we face a very simple but also very challenging question, which is how do we make the governance as inclusive as possible? When it comes to technical stakeholders, it's possible to work. It might be a big room, but you can put everyone in the same room. The same is true about national agencies, but with regards to universities, there are lots of us out there. And so this took a little bit of working and evolution, if I'm honest, regarding the various proposals that we've been exchanging about with the colleagues from the Commission. But the current expectation is that this users group will actually be the cornerstone of what is called the business process owners. Business process owners are, in essence, international relation officers, and I understand that it's easy to ask why to let two acronyms coexist, but there are some methodological reasons for it. So in essence, we envisage setting up what we call a BPO, a Business Process Owners Forum, where those user groups will be key to provide an ongoing conversation about key issues, allow us to understand, what are the pressure points, what are the commonalities. I think many of you already might have participated in user groups run by specific providers, but it's not uninteresting to replicate this effort from a more neutral ground standpoint, also because of what we can learn in terms of cross-benchmarking questions across different such parts of the groups. Of course, that for some parts of the work that awaits us, a collegial body of potentially hundreds of colleagues might not be ideally suited. So there's also going to be a standing group of BPOs where, for example, we will look to involve colleagues that represent national expert groups that can work in tandem, complement each other, facilitate what at the end of the day is really a conversation among members of a community that are in the same boat, oftentimes have similar problems. And I think there's a lot, hopefully, that we can learn from each other, because what we already see, for example, through the service desk, is that certain problems can be a little bit more prevalent depending on what system you're connected to. So this is why it's part of this holistic package that we've been describing. And without further ado, I then move to the next point, which is rather easier to explain. This also comes from studying the feedback that you share with us, sometimes in the chat, in the Q&As. It has been remarked on a few occasions that the kind of webinars like today is a little bit unidirectional. Even if you do our best to answer as many questions as you can in the Q&As, it's still a presentation or several. And so there was merit and credit where credit is due. This is a suggestion from our colleagues from the JAC that we think makes a lot of sense, and we really like it, to have a more open meeting, a tonal meeting in essence. I think the format will be familiar to many of you. And so that we can also have a more fluid dialogue on the issues that affect you. We know that you come to the webinars, you know, sometimes some questions cannot necessarily fit with the topics that are being presented. So let's create this space. We hope already this summer, we hope that the first one can already take place in July. You know, it's summer season, but that's why we will then continue it in autumn. And of course, it will be open for all of those that want to participate, like the webinars are. The target group is roughly the same, and we will try to organize you know, as many spaces to facilitate conversation and exchange of information as possible. There is one last action that I think it's important to share with you under this banner of the No Users Left Behind, which is an assessment report that we aim to publish in September. As with all dates, it's subject to confirmation, but this seems to be the sweet spot. Because, as Valère mentioned, since the 1st of January, the volume of data that we have about what works and what doesn't has increased very significantly. The action points to presenting to you today will lead to much more data being available on such matters. And so it will be important, I think, to collate this data, to make sense of what we know, whether it's through the service desk, whether it's through other channels available to us. And this will allow us to really provide an overview of the state of the art. So this might be service desk, this might be BPOs, this might be statistics that we already have access to. And I think this is important so that we can have not just an informed conversation, but also as much transparency as possible regarding where we stand, what are the key issues that you encounter, and other such matters. Now, at this point, I'm going to shift gears a little bit towards the third vector of the plan, and start with, you know, a very clear statement, which is we need to succeed together at interoperability. There has been an awful lot of finger pointing. I'm not sure it's been very helpful in terms of progress on the ground. We need to shift gears there as well. We need to really work on this as a team, because one node that malfunctions affects all of us, or at least all of its partners, which oftentimes can be hundreds of them. So this is what breaks processes and makes matters so much more difficult for us. And so that means that we need to step up as well, our work with the third-party providers, work more closely, and invest more in the kind of support and the kind of resources that are available to improve the EWP implementation. And the first way in which we can do this is very hands-on, it's very straightforward. And that is the expectation that already this summer, and a date to be agreed with them to maximize participation, we can have two technical meetings, two technical hands-on workshops where we review the implementation of the interinstitutional agreement and the learning agreement functionalities. Together with what I mentioned earlier in the presentation about this proactive debugging, this is where we pin our hopes for quick wins, for quick changes, because oftentimes two developers sitting together, they can make sense of a question much more easily than if they have to ping pong emails for a week or two. We've already seen a little bit of this in recent meetings that have started to resume as the pandemic has allowed. Not very long ago, we had a very important conference in Thessaloniki, where we already could sit down and start exchanging about problems that we have, and we need to do more of this. Now, a second action might seem small, but I think it's important from a due diligence standpoint. We need to make sure that if there are questions, they can be asked in whatever way people are comfortable with. It's essentially expanding on what we already have. We already have monthly meetings with these colleagues. We already have, of course, the EWP GitHub, where many technical discussions are taking place, and which remains the preferential avenue for engaging in this kind of conversations, because it provides an historical record of different opinions. You know, it's really incredible resource to come back to and to understand if we did something wrong in terms of change that we agreed to, and an insight we could have done it somewhat differently. So, but we also feel that some colleagues might appreciate to be able to have such discussions in private. And so obviously we have an obligation to make ourselves available, to share the expertise that we have, which is why they too will become part of the scope of the service desk that was already widened in one of the previous steps that I mentioned. As with many other actions listed here, it's something that we will deploy at once, as soon as the action plan starts, something that's going to run for the length of the action plan, maybe even after it, although this is a little bit to be confirmed. And there is a third action, which is also an excellent idea from our colleagues at EDGEC, which is, if we're serious about recognizing the importance of third-party providers, let's not just try harder to work together to provide more support, to share more insight, but actually invest on this relationship, build trust, build a shared understanding that the compliance is very much a win-win, which is why this will eventually become something that will be taken on by a relationship manager to really make sure that they have our full attention. Now, typically we do prioritize this kind of work with regards to third-party providers, because obviously they represent many universities, or their implementation impacts many universities at once. As resources allow, we of course would be very excited to extend these approaches, this infrastructure, also to the in-house systems, of which, as you know, there's a significant larger number of. And this is actually an important direction for EWP to take, which is, over time, we need a level playing field between all technical elements of the infrastructure. This is true for the relationship managers, but also for the compliance validation that I've mentioned earlier, and many other examples. This action, we will start working on it also immediately. We anticipate that to actually get boots on the ground will happen a little bit down the road, because there will be a recruitment process to this effect, and finding the best candidates. If we can do it within 4 months, we will be very happy indeed. Summer is unfortunately upon us, but this could, I think, be a very significant game changer. So I hope that you see the set of actions outlined here. Let's not try to put it in boxes too much. This is about providing structure and trying to make it easy for you to follow the logic of this design process. But it's really an holistic plan that aims to put the interoperability for all the network users front and center of the work that we're doing. So thank you very much for staying for this discussion. I imagine there will be a few questions, and I'll be right back in the chat to try to follow up.
Yes, we have answered most questions in the Q&A, Joao, but I think there might be some questions that we also want to address live. Let me take a look. I see that most questions regarding the Slack group have been answered, so that's well. I see a question here, maybe Joao can respond, or maybe it's something else. The question is it possible to simultaneously use the Erasmus+ dashboard for IIAs and the third-party provider for Leys? We are having some delays with the implementation of our third-party provider, and we are in urgent need on moving forward with IIAs.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
David, and of course the colleague that asked it. We should be very honest on this point. It is technically possible, but that does not mean it's recommendable. And I mean recommendable not just from a convenience standpoint, because that will be obvious. I understand the point that the colleague makes that if there are delays, it's brilliant that you're looking to be reachable in EWP, and we have to encourage that. But our understanding is that as much as possible, if you already subscribe to a third-party service, it's ideal that you try to run your services from the same place. Of course, things get a bit tricky. It's easier to say in abstract if the delays are such that you're compromising your work and the work of your colleagues. And this is why technically the possibility remains. But I wouldn't want this to sound like an invitation for you to come over to the dashboard. I think we're already starting to see, because different providers have different implementations, different characteristics. We recently have been made aware of issues that have to do with sharing data on the organizational unit API, whether it lives on the dashboard or in your third-party provider. And I think it's a good time to be very blunt about this, which is ideally you will have all your services in the same place. Of course, the transition is upon us, but let's perhaps consider this as a really, really last resort solution if there is no other way for your colleagues to reach you electronically.
Yeah, and I have one question following up on that, because there are a few questions regarding switching and the interaction between third-party provider and dashboards. There was a question from somebody saying we plan to switch OLA from dashboard to a third-party provider. But as I understood from previous webinars and from our third-party provider, if we switch now, students will lose their OLAs. Is this true? When will the switch be possible without losing data? So I think there is some fear that if the people switch, that they lose everything that they have. I don't know if it's a known issue or that's something that's possible.
It is an issue, and I think the colleague is right to plan this carefully. Normally, the standard advice is avoid switching while, for example, synchronize a switch to the academic year. Start with a fresh generation, if you will, of exchange students from one system to avoid the back and forth that would inevitably ensue. And this is partially, to be very honest, as well, because currently there is not a technical solution to make sure that this migration is as easy as we would like it to be very honest. So there is some work being done on this. There are some discussions among the technical stakeholders. It's not currently one of our key priorities, but we know that the need is upon us and will probably increase over time if we look at the next year or 2 years. And we are optimistic that we will be able to share some good news, but we would still need some time, because the ideas that some of our colleagues and technical teams have and that they've been exploring, to be honest, they need to be tested. We need to, before we come to a webinar and say, hey, everyone, here's a button, push it and everything is going to be all right. We're not there yet. So I think, again, it's important to be transparent about this. If you're going to do the switch in this suboptimal conditions, then I think the sensible thing to do is try to have a clear cutoff point. So if you have students that are, for example, in the ULA, maybe they can complete the operations of their learning agreements there. The new ones would eventually start from the third-party provider, and we will keep you abreast if we have more news on other ways to hack this challenging issue.
All right, thank you, Joao. I just want to let know everybody that we still have some time. So if you have a question, just post it in the Q&A and we will see if we can address it. I think that maybe this is a question that you can answer, Paul. It's regarding the user group, the Slack groups. The question is like, who should enter the Slack group? Is it only for IT people or people with an in-house system or third-party providers, or for Erasmus coordinators, or is it for everyone? So maybe you can give some more background to that.
Thank you very much, David, and as well for the colleague for asking this question, because if that was not clear from my presentation, I would like to apologize. This is first and foremost meant for colleagues working in the IRO, so the practitioners who have to deal with Erasmus paper-related issues, who are working in an in-house system or a third-party provider system and trying to establish those interinstitutional agreements, learning agreements online. So it's really meant for the colleagues probably also attending the webinar. There are other channels where technical people can also interact with each other. There's also part of the governance, there's the infrastructure forum, and all nodes in production, and there's many already are represented there. So the providers are there, also colleagues working with an in-house solution are invited. And so they discuss technical issues at this technical forum, but IRO colleagues are invited to join the user groups and be active in this IRO layer of information exchange, which doesn't mean that maybe the provider will also take part of the user group, but it's first and foremost meant for IRO people in order to exchange practices. And if you're using a SIS development, for example, you can also address questions to other colleagues working with a student information system, an in-house system. Okay, how did you approach certain processes? This is really meant to be an open forum where colleagues facing the same issues, being it with the same third-party provider or dealing with in-house implementations, can address such issues to the colleagues. And then there will also be the meetings twice a year indeed. So once again, it's first and foremost for people working in international relations, managing student mobility, and we very often refer to those colleagues as IRO, international relations officers.
All right, and just adding to that, Paul, there's somebody was asking if the discussion will be moderated.
We plan to have a more open discussion there. But I would also like to link the user groups to one of the last points that Joao made about the action plan, is that we also will have relation managers. I think the relation manager can also play a role in these user groups, because they will be in touch with the third-party provider. And I think the discussions in the user groups will provide powerful insights. So there will be no strict moderation. If people have technical issues, they of course also need to address them via the appropriate channels by raising issues at the third-party provider or at the ESCI service portal. But this is really meant to be a platform where IROs can directly exchange between each other. And I would also like to add there, and I lost what I wanted to add, so I leave it there. Maybe Joao has still something.
Right. No, and I think that people should understand these user groups in a way that it's not that you have a free forum to say what you want and nobody will be looking at it. I mean, if, like Paul mentioned, if certain things come out of there and we see many people talking about the same issue or addressing something, it's something that we will take up in other government bodies and other fora. I think I have like the question that we would like to answer as well, because it's related in a way that someone needs to ask, like, when experienced a problem or a bug with exchanging data via ABP, how do we know if it's best to reach out to our provider for support or the ESCI service desk? I can quickly say about that. I think that you should see it as like having multiple horses, in the way that there is some fail-safe in this, that if you reach out to your third-party provider and they say, well, the issue is not with us, etc. I mean, the ESCI service desk can play like a mediator, because they can also see where the issue is. So I think it's important that you don't do only one of them. I think you should see the ESCI service desk as an extra way of being able to reach out to the service provider. Or is there anything else that you want to add about it, Joao?
Well, actually, I don't know if we were looking at the same question. I was queuing up for answers because I noticed there was a question from Thomas about what you do when you encounter issues. And I think this dovetails a little bit with what you were saying, which maybe was actually based on the question that Renata shared. So let me try to break it down a little bit. What we are aiming to do in terms of the ESCI service desk is to go one step further, is to see when you have raised an issue towards your provider that is specifically about interoperability. Now, we could have an interesting conversation of how do you know that the issue has to do with interoperability? But we can also, I think many of you will have this experience, know that, you know, if it is about a bug in the system, something that is misconfigured, you know, we don't want to get in the middle of your relationship with your provider. So this is particularly interesting for questions that have to do with reaching out to universities that are in the network using systems different than your own, where either you have errors, this morning, for example, we had an interesting example of a colleague that was remarking that he received interinstitutional agreements from another system, and they were broken in a way that made it difficult for him or her to work with those agreements. So here we're firmly, clearly on the field of something that gets manipulated, that gets distorted in the process of being transmitted over EWP, that I think we can step in and at least try to make sense of. And so this is the line that we will have to navigate together. We still have no authority, and we shouldn't have, to be very clear, to go into another system and start fiddling with it and trying to debug. So we will very much rely on a good cooperation with the partners to follow up on those issues when they are raised. So there's going to be a bit of a learning curve to define the sweet spot. We are aware of that. When this action starts, we will, of course, try to produce documentation and configure the service desk to kind of nudge you into what would be the suitable scope of the questions. And really the goal is that we can help each other out, figuring out what is wrong and making sure that it is being followed up to the best of everybody's possibilities. The example that, sorry, now I missed the name of the colleague that Thomas gave. Okay, so it was already mentioned, I think, by Paul, that there is a meeting point for the different technical stakeholders, us, the third-party providers, even the in-house systems, which I'm really happy they're playing a larger and larger role in these discussions. So when technical issues are known to any of these parties, the natural thing to do is to raise it either bilaterally or at one of the so-called infrastructure forum meetings. What I don't know is whether the show-stopping issues that you allude to are rather to do with EWP. I suspect that might be the case, because otherwise you probably wouldn't raise the point in today's webinar. But even then, we probably need to distinguish about issues that have to do with, for example, updates that are in the pipeline from the side of your provider. That timeline we do not control. At best, we can try to raise awareness when really important updates are due to improve everyone's collaboration. So we have the means to stay in good contact with one another. It's really understanding when a given issue is illegible, when we are in position to take action, you know, have the grounds for a good conversation. I'm sorry it sounds tentative. The action hasn't started yet, as you will understand. I think the dust will settle on this relatively quickly. I think the scoping will be elaborated further, better than what I can put on words as I talk to you. And we will rely on your feedback, plugging in the user groups again, to make sure that the messages are as clear as possible, and that are useful and relevant for you.
I think that we have been responding to many questions in the Q&A, and I know that our colleagues from the European Commission have been doing the same as well. But I would like to give the floor to Alex to respond quickly to a question about the fact that academics here are overlapping and people are saying that they're preparing OLAs for 2022, 2023, and how that feeds into what you were saying earlier about the timeline this year and next year.
Yes, absolutely. So I would like to clarify again that we fully understand that in order to exchange digital IAAs and in order to sign learning agreements, there need to be a partner for tango, two for tango, no, they say. So you need to be ready digitally, but also your partner needs to be ready to accept this document and sign it digitally. So in the case that you are ready, however, your partner is not ready, what we suggest is to underpin the learn agreement or the IAA with a PDF and an email, so by paper agreement. Now, in the moment that both sides are able to exchange digitally, both you and your partner, then you will need to pass to a digital format. What it means that, of course, there is a risk that we lose the mobilities to underpin with the digital learn agreements, the mobilities in the fall 22, which are very soon now. However, as I mentioned, if your partner is not ready, what you can do is at least prepare from your side. Then from the next calendar year, so from 2023, the point on digitalization will be monitored as part of the ECHA monitoring guideline. So institutions, also the ones that are not ready, also the ones that have challenges, will understand that this is important to move forwards with this point. And I know it doesn't only depend on the will of an institution itself, but it depends on the work of the third-party provider, of the IT teams. But this is exactly why there is in place the action plan that aims to provide this kind of support, this kind of help, this kind of standardization to advance the whole process. So I hope this reassures you that, I mean, of course, the idea is to be ready by already by this fall, but we understand this is not so simple. And this is why still, if your partner is not ready, then either extend existing IAAs or exchange paper IAAs, and when ready, pass to digital. I hope this clarifies the question. And if you have any further questions, then don't hesitate.
Thank you, Alex. We have, I think we can have time for one more question, Joao, and then maybe we can have some closing words. Again, we have some questions regarding currently using a third-party provider and then switching to the dashboard to manage some of the functionalities. I don't know if you want to say some final words about that. Because you mentioned earlier that it's always it's a tricky situation at the moment as we stand now, but maybe it's also a good moment to give a final overview of how we're going to try to work together with third-party providers to make sure that there is no really a need to switch anymore in an ideal situation.
David, is your question inspired by the question from Celia?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks to Celia for the question. Celia, maybe I'm misconstruing your question. I've heard that question being asked in a different way. Maybe it's not the same. But I think some colleagues understood some time ago that, you know, we could save ourselves a lot of problems if we're all in the same system. But I really could not, which is true, because then we don't have interoperability. We're all sitting in the same website, pushing the same buttons. But I really wouldn't want to come across as saying that the dashboard can fulfill this role. Yes, it should resolve the issues of electronic data exchange. You're right, because in effect, there will be no exchange. They would all be in the same environment. But although it is a process that is testing, I think, everybody's patience, I think the benefits of being able to choose where you want to be, which system best suits our needs, is something that I don't think that we would say that outweighs the benefits of overcoming the teething issues that EWP encounters. I think it's also appropriate to finish with a note of optimism. I think if things go as we hope, as we plan, we've already seen a lot of progress, and it's obvious that when you're sitting in a system that hasn't been reviewed, updated, fixed, then this might sound very strange. You know, where's the progress? But we've seen really many systems converging at an admirable pace. We will do everything in our power to make sure that everybody gets to the point where stuff works without you having to lose your sleep about whether the agreement reached the party or your partner or didn't. So I'm not at the point, and I speak a little bit personally here, where I say that the benefits of getting everyone in the same website outweighs the risks that entails. That creates a one point of failure, that creates a one size fits all. I think deep down we agreed that the way it should be is roughly that, you know, you really have the freedom to connect with system A, B, or C. And let's try to make that work. I think we are closer to the end of the tunnel than to the beginning, or at least I think the data that we have points to that. I'm very excited to see how much data points we can collect in September to see this honest balance between what works, what doesn't. We need to use the user groups, the meetings, the town halls, the webinars to talk about this, to make sense about this together, because it's also about being very rational and cold about where the obstacles are. Sometimes one obstacle, if you can remove it, it goes a long way. It can impact a couple of hundreds of users. So I refuse to end this webinar with you today on a negative note. I really hope that very soon we don't have to contemplate moving all to the same environment to be able to cooperate seamlessly with one another.
Thank you, Joao. And I think on that we can kind of round up this webinar. I want to thank all the speakers and also the participants for your time and for being here. I think, as Joao mentioned, we know there are still many questions, but one of the things that we'll have soon, according to the action plan, is that we will have a town hall meeting that I assume it will, in large part, focus on the action plan, where we will be able to answer more questions and go more in dialogue about some of the things that remain after today. As you are aware, the presentations will be made available via the Competence Center, and the recordings will be available via the European Student Card Initiative YouTube channel. Further information, I think, that we will have, or analysis, for example, as Paul mentioned from the survey, will be shared with the national agencies, and you can expect some feedback via that way. So thank you for your time, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. In Belgium, it's super hot, so I know I'm in need of some dehydration at this moment. So thank you, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.